Yeah.
So the technology has gifted us with a shorter discussion period. I'll go quickly through one question. It really deals with what I think all three of you were talking about, which is a kind of critical capacity of communications. And I in the context of unheard voices or history discovered or imagined futures, all of that seemed like there was a place to put that in the discussion. I was particularly enamored, Victoria, with your, I know this place loves me because, and I think about what if every precedent invited that question and then the story that would follow. It has a different edge to it than nuclear or climate disaster. And it gives you a way forward rather than a way to stop. And so in some ways, all of you are dealing with critical in different dimensions, but toward what end, what kind of relationship and empowerment in the context of able to do does it invite? That is, what's the agency of communications in some fundamental ways? And I'm thinking about it in the context of those 88 case studies I mentioned, but there's thousands of precedents that are used so badly with no evidence whatsoever to suggest that they're any good at all, except I like it. And maybe we can get smarter in our communications about that. So that's the underpinning to the question. So all three of you can take a shot at that.
Agency of what? What's the question?
She has my
She's got it.
I do, but I don't understand the question because
Bring it back.
agency of what?
Okay. So I'm just curious about the agency of communication. You described kind of what's it enable us to do different in the world? How does it function? It's after all just communication, right?
And you want me to start?
You'll start. Oh, okay. So I'll refer to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. All psychology students, so parked up there. So two of the key needs are to be valued, right? Esteem and self-actualization. And in plain terms, to be heard, to be seen, and to be able to express yourself as you want to express yourself. So that I think is the critical element in the communication, that if people don't feel that they have that in a place, then they're probably going to feel that they are second class citizens in broad sense, or even worse.
The thing that this question brings to mind for me is the fact that, we've done hundreds of stories and heard people talk about their experience with the city, and we really focused on marginalized communities. And the thing that we found after doing all of those stories is that marginalized communities have very similar experiences. Details are different. But, for example, folks who came into Denver in the 1850s or 60s experienced the same thing that migrants coming from Venezuela today experience, in that they have trouble finding housing, they have trouble finding a job that will support them, they have trouble finding education for their children, they face racism, they face marginalization, right? Like, the redlining. Technically, there isn't redlining today, but yes, there is, right? Let's be honest. So the thing that strikes me is these stories exist, and these folks are happy to tell them if you ask them to. But what we don't do is ask, and what we don't do is learn. Like, if all of the, we're still getting the same result from our policies, then we should look again at our policies and see how can we do things differently. And if we're all talking to each other and we're in a vacuum, we have the same perspectives. I mean, one of the things you talked about with children, I have children. Oh my God, like they're keep me honest, right? Because they have no hesitation in pointing out my hypocrisy or whatever. And I think that's what you can get if you're honest with community, if you allow them to really talk to you about what they're experiencing or what their challenges are or what they would suggest. I mean, it's an untapped resource that I think we don't often enough listen to. And so I think in that respect, communicating in a way that can create a loop, right? I mean, that was one of the things we hoped when we started the Office of Storytelling, that we wouldn't be talking at people, and we didn't want them talking at us, that we really would want to listen and then, have a conversation. We could all take something away from them. I think that's where I would love to see all of us go for our own betterment. I mean, the reality is we are facing catastrophe. And if we can't figure out a way to do things differently, when we listen to each other and learn from each other, there may be very dire consequences. Having children, I hope that we figure it out.
I think I have a couple of thoughts. So you may remember Sophia, age 8. This is a horrible idea, bad for the country. That image. So part of the story I skipped over was that in that same project, by doing that and opening up the conversation, we went to the space a lot and experienced it in different ways. And when we did a participatory budgeting exercise with the middle school students, not Sophia, but a middle school group. And there was one group in particular said, they had a budget and they had to decide what they were going to do with it. And they're like, we want all the money to go to protecting the wildlife corridor. So we actually don't want to do anything in the park. And we want the money to go to the unhoused who are currently living there. And I mean, I think that says a lot, because the conversation that ensued was really, and I know that we have very acute, very extreme differences in wealth in our country, but for the most part, we have what we need. And if we did better job of sharing, we have more than enough. And so I think that participatory budgeting exercise was really kind of profound, in the sense that it was really them seeing that and saying, it's okay, I don't need this to change. And actually we could make it better for wildlife by not channelizing the river and putting a farmer's market on top of it, and instead put those resources to something that's a clear need in our community. And but the bigger thing with that is that I think that this is part of a lot of community engaged design learning, has been that, designers and planners, by the very nature of the work, we focus on the tangible outcomes. And those are important. But I think often it's done at the expense of what we've been talking about, which is that the things that people really value in these processes is the actual community building that's happening, and that in itself is a form of placemaking. So that's my response to that.
Yeah, sure. I'll add. Two things. I mean, I think in the communication side, and this is again in terms of practice for planners, architects, landscape architects, we're taught to think in terms of nouns, but people think about places in terms of adjectives. So we have to understand what those adjectives are and then translate that into nouns and help them translate. And also the communication aspect, we think of place itself as a mental construct, and then placemaking of spaces is essentially a collective work of fiction that is striving to become a true story. So we are writing the story together, and then hopefully making it come true.
Thank you. Conrad.
It's not Conrad.
Someone from the virtual world.
Yes. So for what I believe is our last question, from the Q&A chat, I'm going to both paraphrase and maybe contextualize it in today's conversation. So after talking today about placemaking often being driven by conflict and crisis, and seeing how storytelling and community perspectives can add fuel to placemaking, I ask, what is the best way to use methods of communicating place to encourage and incentivize those in positions of power to consider larger conflicts and crises such as climate change?
This is where I'm glad I'm a moderator.
All right, okay, we'll start. Well, again, listening to stories of people. So the climate, the climate crisis. We have climate refugees in our country, people who came from the global south because of the changes in the climate, and to tell their story about why they came, or to hear their stories about why they came, I think, and connect their personal stories to the larger narrative.
I think it's really difficult to force listening, right? Especially because they could pretend to listen, but will they actually act? Right? And so, I mean, honestly, that was why we chose storytelling, because it is emotional. You hear somebody's story, and the Denver stories, for example, odds are good if you're in Denver and you're from Denver or you have a connection to Denver, you'll see something that you relate to. And if you watch these stories, I mean, we found that people did make connections that they didn't even understand they were going to make. And so I think where we had hoped to take the project actually was to force that issue by, hosting the screenings that we already did and had conversations with community, but really making sure that, we asked the city council person to come from the area, had the neighbors ask them, to make them accountable, to have them come in and have the conversation, which you'll notice we did history, right? Because then we could have a tough conversation, but not be talking about this administration. We're talking about that administration. Oh man, they messed up, right? And we're safe. We could have a conversation. But the hope was that if we had those conversations, we could reveal some things and force some action and get some emotion and some connection and maybe make a difference. Who knows?
I think the only thing I would add is, and I don't want this to sound condescending in this room, but I think training of how to really integrate these different modes into decision-making processes. And I say that from the work that I was doing in Boulder, where there was a really wide range of perspectives on whether this was a good idea, and it went from a small number of people who actually had positions of power saying, yeah, we think this is a good idea and we think it's important, to many. And I feel like the biggest success we had was there was one time there was a proposal going before city council, and the poor staff person who presented it just got grilled about every way that they had incorporated children and youth's perspectives into the project. And I think I saw it as a true success because it was like this had become so normalized and they had really seen the value of this, that they wanted the accountability in every decision that was being made in the city. That does not mean that that happened every single time. But I think if we are actually paying attention and listening to youth voices right now, the loudest thing that they're talking about is climate change. And this is the climate generation. And if we were listening to them, it used to be that people, older youth or young adults were talking about it. And now it's, very young children who can't sleep at night. So I think if they were in conversation with that, it makes it a little harder to not want to address it.
Mhm.
There may be a question in this. I mean, just thinking about this, the storytelling thing, I mean, is so important. And I love this idea that places are not just lovable, but loving. How do I tell that the place loves me? I've never heard anybody put it that way before, but yes, of course. But the thing about the storytelling that you were doing, which it just makes me so sad that they're shuttering that office, because I thought, wow, that is the coolest thing I've heard in a long time. But so I once encountered a quote that supposedly was Charlie Parker when asked about Bebop. He supposedly said, "It's stories we tell ourselves about ourselves."
Mhm.
This form of art.
Mhm.
And I took a slide out of my presentation that basically placemaking is stories we're telling ourselves about ourselves, sort of collectively. And I was thinking about your stories. They're not just stories. Very often, if you ask people for their stories and they tell you what about themselves, their personal narrative about, how they ended up where they ended up, that doesn't always connect people very well. A lot of times people are making excuses for their bad decisions, and they're justifying and they're complaining. But when they tell stories that have to do with their experience of place, that is connecting in an extraordinarily powerful way. So across ethnic boundaries, across class boundaries, across gender bound, if they're, listening to that somebody talk about, the how the place they grew up was, the little house on the prairie, and then ever after you could go to that place and you stand at that intersection and think, wow, now I know what this was like before, and it provides a connection that I think is it's very sad that your city sort of didn't really understand the extraordinary power of what that could have continued to do for them.
I guess I would just complement that by saying there's a lot of cities that aren't taking advantage of exactly that. We're over time, so I'm going to have to hold this and invite you to leave, and thank you.